Chapter 22, Travel. She woke up, the sun still shining in her face. Judging by its position, it was now noon. The rumors, the conversation with the administrator, and her feigned behavior over the past few days would hopefully convince people that Ruby had committed suicide, troubled by the disappearance of Lily and Max and having lost hope for her future. Remembering that her warden had told her that they could detonate the incineration collar at any time, from anywhere, she assumed that they were keeping track of the collars, and she hoped that the melting of the collar would tell them that Ruby was dead. However, she still had to be careful, especially since she was still so close to the barrier, so she started crawling, the blackened skin around her joints flaking off as she moved forward, the gleam of coiling muscle underneath her skin visible. Her fingers barely able to move, she picked up her scythe and cut open her mouth, her lips having been burned away and fused together due to the intense heat. Biting down on the scythe, she picked up her ammo clips and threw them ahead of her, then started moving towards them. She dragged herself along for hours, tossing the ammo ahead of her, clawing forward with the charred bone from her fingertips, using the blackened stumps of her legs to push herself along. Ruby grimly realized that her immolation had cauterized her wounds, stemming any blood flow. The sun was low in the sky when Ruby found her first meal. Finding a small hole in the ground, she camped next to it, waiting for the prairie dog to pop out of the hole. A few minutes later its head poked out, sniffing curiously. Ruby slammed her fingers down, impaling the squirming animal on her bony fingers. Closing her fist and crushing the creature, she raised it to her mouth, lapping at the rivulets of blood that spilled down its fur. After it had stopped squirming and had mostly bled out, Ruby ripped off its head, chewing and crunching it in her mouth, her sharp, strong teeth making short work of the skull. She ate the rest of it in large bites, hoping that the food would give her body the resources it needed to heal. Finishing up her meal, she dusted her hands off and continued crawling. After hours of non-stop crawling, the landscape had begun to change, grass beginning to grow under her, supporting animal life such as the prairie dog she had just eaten. It was nearly night time, the sun already beginning to set. Although her newly returned aura pushed her along and kept her strong, she began to grow a little sleepy, her stomach full from the meal and her body telling her to rest and heal. She decided to take a nap and continue crawling during the night, where she could watch out for predators that might try to take advantage of her weakened state. Moving into a tall patch of grass, she curled up and slept. She woke up feeling a bit itchy and dusty. The two moons were high in the sky, one full and one fractured. Ruby sat up, bits of ash falling off of her body, small patches of pink skin underneath. The stumps of her legs felt a little longer than before, her body using the food she ate to regrow her lost limbs. Her torso and arms were still skeletal, the fat underneath her skin having been burned away by the fire, but her muscles weren't exposed anymore. The sounds of grunts and squeals were suddenly audible. Ruby froze, a hand on her side, as she listened for the Borbatusk herd. The night was dark, the two moons provided little light. Ruby unfolded her scythe, anchoring the blade end into the ground. Pivoting the makeshift sniping stand with her, she looked around, searching for signs of motion. A large body, then two, then many appeared to her side, the Borbatusks panting and circling her. They were 7 feet long, with thick, muscular bodies and tall shoulders, white armor covering them and long tusks protruding from their mouths. One of them cautiously walked towards her, sniffing to see if Ruby was anything edible. With no hesitation, Ruby grabbed hold of its tusks, and with her other hand firmly grasping the scythe anchored in the ground, she pulled the Borbatusk towards her, making it squeal as she positioned the muzzle of scythe over its unprotected belly. Pulling the trigger, she blew 2 holes into it, then took her scythe out of the ground and swung upwards, gutting the Borbatusk. It flailed weakly as its internal organs spilled out, the blood and guts showering onto Ruby. The other Borbatusks milled around for a bit and then fled, unsure of how to deal with this new threat that had dispatched them so easily. The viscera of the Borbatusk soaked through her skin, giving her a tingling feeling as her aura pulsed around her. Using her scythe, she systematically butchered the hog grim, slicing off the hard plates of armor and carving out chunks of flesh. Settling back onto the ground, she had a nighttime meal. Only able to eat a small portion of the grim, she had to leave the rest to scavengers as she continued moving, putting distance between her and the camp. 2 weeks passed by like this, Ruby waking up each day with more of her limbs regrown and fresh skin slowly replacing the black crust of charcoal on her body. Nevermore's had flew across the sky a few times, forcing Ruby to lie low in the grass to avoid being snatched up and dropped from thousands of feet in the air. She stayed away from caves and suspicious rock outcroppings, wary of fighting deathstalkers in her weakened state. Ruby found it fascinating to watch her legs grow, the knees slowly coming back and then the calves and the ankles, and then finally her feet and toes. Her skin was white and pale and unmarked again, her scars having been burned away. She fashioned crude leather sandals out of tough Borbatusk hide, using braids of dried grass to secure them to her feet. Finally able to walk again, she ran for a bit to get used to her new feet before she started heading back in the opposite direction, back towards the camp. A few hours later, the sun high in the sky, she neared the barrier, the heat distortion giving away its position. Circling around the barrier, she found the trail used by delivery trucks. The road wound across the landscape and would end at the main gate, where prisoners and supplies were dropped off. Turning back and running down the road, she traveled for a few miles before stopping and hiding in the grass by the trail, waiting for a truck to come by. Hours later, Ruby was dozing off, bored of waiting, when faint rumbles against the ground alerted her that a vehicle was approaching. The truck only 100 feet away, Ruby left her side in the grass and ran onto the road. The truck driver had just started braking when the vehicle reached Ruby. She jumped up, the hood of the vehicle barely skimming her sandals, and slammed into the windshield arms first, the glass shattering around her and cutting her arms a little. Extending her right palm, she let the velocity of the truck push the unfortunate truck driver's head into her hand. His head ruptured, skull fragments and ropes of skin scattering around the interior, even as Ruby's arm and elbow dislocated from the shock. The truck swerved, sliding off the road and onto the flat soil, the wheels having little traction against the loose dirt. A few seconds later, the truck finally stopped, the smell of burnt rubber wafting through the shattered windshield. Ruby picked herself off of the floor, blood dripping from the cuts on forearms, popping her elbow and shoulder joints back into place. A little hungry from all the excitement, Ruby took a few bites from the truck driver's neck, her sharp teeth ripping through his muscles and crushing his vertebrae. She was still naked, so she took off the trucker's bloody denim jacket, slipping her arms into it and rolling up the sleeves. She buttoned up the front as tightly as she could, the jacket still hanging loosely on her. Stripping him of his pants, she cut the brown work pants halfway down the shins so she wouldn't trip, and put them on, using the belt buckle to prevent it from falling down. His steel-toed leather boots were a little big, but still better than her makeshift sandals, so wore them and tightened the shoelaces as much as possible. She then shoved his body behind the passenger seat, unlocked the door, and got out of the truck. Pulling glass fragments from her face and arms, she walked back to her hiding spot and picked up her scythe. The truck had slid 100 feet from the road, but it seemed otherwise unharmed. Yang had let Ruby try out her motorcycle once, but Ruby had almost wrecked it, forced to jump off after almost hitting a tree. Otherwise, Ruby had no experience in driving, but she was confident she could figure out it. Entering the driver's seat, she first turned off the engine and pulled out the keys, then made sure she could put the keys back in and turn the engine back on. There was still a decent amount of fuel left, the truck driver having planned to make a return trip. The spider web glass was obstructing her vision, so she used the blunt end of her scythe to smash the rest of the glass out, hoping that no rocks would fly through the hole while she was driving. Moving the shift lever to drive, she gently pushed down on the pedal, the truck giving a grumble and moving forward. Ever so slowly, Ruby managed to move the truck back onto the road, afraid that she would tip over and lose her only mode of quick transportation. Driving slowly for the first hour, and then speeding up, she drove until the sky started growing dark, the sun setting. The landscape had become greener, more lush, with actual vegetation by the side of the road and a few clumps of leafy trees. Small hills covered in green grass had appeared on the sides of the road. She stopped the truck at the side of the trail, shifting the lever to park and pulling out the keys. Biting a few more chunks out of the truck driver's forearm, she leaned her seat back and dozed off, feeling safe in her vehicle. She woke up early the next morning, the sky still a pale blue, the sun yet to fully rise. The trucker's body was a little stiff, but not yet decaying, so Ruby deemed it safe to eat and ripped off pieces of his shoulder, absent-mindedly chewing as she thought out her plan. She didn't really have one, as her only goal right now was to get to the hoverjet port where she had been dropped off at by following the road. She'd probably have to steal a hoverjet, but she wasn't sure how she would accomplish that. Yawning and stretching, she put the key back into the ignition, turning the engine on and shifting the lever to drive. She was probably close, as she had been driving for hours now. Getting back in the road, she confidently accelerated to a decent speed, driving down the mostly straight path. At around noon, she saw a small compound in the distance, situated in a clearing, surrounded by a line of trees. Stopping her truck by the side of the road, she ate a bit more of the truck driver's chest, then hauled him out of the truck, dropping him deep in the line of trees where animals would get rid of the body. Grabbing her scythe and getting out of the truck, she trotted off towards the compound, intending to scout it out before she tried to break in. The hoverjet port consisted of a few small, low buildings, the overall area much smaller than the camp. 7 trucks were parked in a small lot easily accessible through the main entrance. The low fences were just links of metal, with no barbed wire or spotlights or guard towers, security obviously not high on the occupants' minds. The location was remote, Ruby seeing no cities or other signs of civilization anywhere near the compound. Even as she watched, a massive hoverjet approached from the distance, floating over the port and then descending straight down into the center of the compound. The back of the hoverjet opened and about 20 people swarmed it, entering the hoverjet and wheeling out large wooden crates. Ruby took the opportunity, hoping that all of the workers would be preoccupied with unloading the hoverjet as she left the cover of the tree line and began sprinting towards the camp. Half a minute later, she reached the fences and jumped them, dashing into the cover of the nearest building. Looking around the corners and making sure that no one had raised an alarm, she ran towards the parking lot. With one more check to make sure that no one was around, she sliced through the locks on the hatches at the back of the truck and lifted the sliding door up, just enough for her to crawl through, then gently set the door down behind her. There was one dim light at the ceiling of the truck, gently illuminating the contents of the back. Randomly choosing a crate, she unlatched the lid and opened it up to find it full of steel coolers, labeled with the names of Grimm. She shifted the containers of specimens aside and made room for herself, her thin frame able to slide into the spaces between the containers. Reaching up and latching the container from the inside, she settled down and waited for them to begin loading. An hour later, she heard voices coming from the outside of the truck. "Hey, Bobby. Yeah. This lock here's broken. You know anything about it? Let me take a look at it." A pair of footsteps came near the vehicle. "Hey, looks like one of them damn Ursas tried to claw it open. Open it up, see if anything got damaged." The door rattled as it was pushed up. "Everything seems fine, guess the Ursa couldn't figure out how to open the door. Alright, let's get these loaded onto the jet." Ruby let out a small sigh of relief as they began moving the crates, hauling them onto wheeled cargo carriers and rolling them down a ramp and off of the truck. There was a grunt and Ruby's crate shifted to the side, onto the carrier. She felt herself being wheeled for a minute, and then she leaned forward a bit as she was pushed up the ramp and into the back of the hoverjet. As she was pushed off of the carrier, she heard one of the workers let out a cry of surprise. "Whoa, what the hell is that thing? Is that a fucking devil?" Ruby perked her ears and listened closely. It sounded like someone was talking to themselves in different tones and voices, at times muttering softly and at other times angrily berating itself. "Yeah, special delivery. It's some weird type of faunus. Kinda looks like a little demon, huh? Just keep your hands away from him." The voices walked off, still talking. Ruby heard a whirring noise as the cargo bay closed, the locking mechanism sealing shut with a hiss. The hoverjet took off, shooting upwards and then forward. After waiting a few more minutes just to be careful, Ruby opened up the top of her crate and peeked out, her head barely clearing the sides. Aside from a little faunus with horns and a spaded tail that was sitting on the ceiling of his cage, upside down and muttering to himself, the coast was clear. Ruby took the worker's advice and skirted around the cage, the faunus inside ignoring her. The cargo area was filled with crates of all sorts of sizes, live animals inside some of the cages. The entire area was gleaming white, the ceiling and floor covered in a grid pattern. She walked up the steps at the front of the massive cargo area, quietly opening the door and slipping in. Ruby found herself in a small hallway, dimly lit with light bulbs in the ceiling. There were a few doors that entered into the hallway. Ruby opened the first one and checked inside, finding that the door led to a small living quarter, just enough space for a bunk bed and a desk. The next door led to a small food preparation area, the next to a supply room, then a bathroom, and then finally a small office. Done surveying the rooms, she crept towards the last door at the end of the hallway. Putting her ear against the cold metal, she heard a pilot speaking into a radio and flicking switches. In one quick motion, she ripped the door off of its hinges and threw it down the hallway, not risking the possibility of the hinges squeaking. Before the pilots could react, she had an arm around each of their throats, choking them. "Tell them you're fine, and then turn off the radio," she whispered into their ears. They hesitated. "Do it or you die. I don't care if this plane goes down with me, I'll live but you two won't." Their voices and hands trembling slightly, they complied, reassuring the other end and turning the radios off. Ruby used the opportunity to look over them. One was gray-haired and clean-shaven, looking to be in his 60s. The other man was young and had light golden brown hair, good-looking a rugged way, his brown eyes wide with fright. "All right, great," Ruby said brightly, happy that things were going her way. "So which one of you is the pilot?" "Me," the old man said, a tremor in his voice. "My son's just the co-pilot, I'm the one you want." "So that mean I don't need him, right?" Ruby said, beginning to squeeze her arm around the young man's throat. "No. That's not what I meant," the old man cried. The plane tilted a little as his hand twitched. "Do I need him to fly the plane?" Ruby asked, puzzled. "Yes. Well, I mean no, but..." "Dad," the young man cried out in fear. The old man began speaking quickly, nervous. "You don't have to hurt any of us, just tell me where you want to go, we'll keep quiet, we just deliver tea." "Shish," Ruby said, a little annoyed. She paused, thinking. Her plan hadn't really extended this far, so she had to think a little about what to do. Do you know anyone named Jack Everest?" It was a wild guess, but that was the only thing she had. The old man nodded rapidly, relieved. Yes, everyone knows him. He's the head of the Department of State Affairs, pretty famous for." "Do you know where he lives?" Ruby asked, interrupting him. The old man paused for a few seconds, sweat beading on his forehead. "Please don't kill him. He lives in a mansion in the upper-class district, I know where it is," the young man squeaked out. Ruby looked at him, surprised. "Well, I guess you're more useful than your dad." The old man moaned in fear. "All right, if you know where it is, then let's go." What? I can't just fly to his house." Ruby leaned down, looking him in the eye and baring her sharp teeth, a bit of her aura slipping out and coating her in red. "You'll bring me there, or I'll tear you to pieces." The young man gulped and nodded. Ruby smiled and straightened back up. "Do you guys have a parachute? I can just drop down onto his house if you guys don't want to land on it." It's in the storage box on the wall," the old man said. "Great. All right, let's go already. I'll just stay here and watch over the two of you until we get there." The young man punched coordinates onto a screen in front of him, sweating profusely as he mistyped a number and had to re-enter it. "We'll get there in about 12 hours at top speed." His face paled as he realized how long Ruby would have to stay here with them. "No problem," Ruby said, sitting down on the floor and taking her arms away from their necks. "If I think either of you are doing something you shouldn't be, I'll just kill one of you and have the other one to fly." She sat still, humming to herself. A few minutes later, Ruby found herself bored out of her mind. "So, do you guys know any jokes?" "We've arrived," the old man said, relieved. It had been a long 12 hours, and both pilots were exhausted. Ruby looked energetic and determined, having finally reached her goal. "How far up are we?" Ruby asked, standing up and stretching. "We're about 2,000 feet up, right over Everest's house. Any lower and people will start getting suspicious." Ruby nodded, walking to the storage box and grabbing a parachute pack, sliding her arms through the straps. The old man exchanged a glance with his son. Before you go, can we ask why? He killed my parents, Ruby said darkly. They were silent for a moment. Well, I'll be going now, she said, pulling open the door on the side of the cabin. Wait, we haven't told you how to use the parachute yet. Ruby jumped out of the hoverjet, only just realizing what they said. Whoops, she thought to herself, flailing at her straps and randomly pulling at cords. Her parachute partially deployed, half of the cloth inflating while the other half was stuck in the pack. Spiraling downwards at an alarming rate, Ruby braced herself, flaring her aura. Her aura mostly protected her as she slammed into the courtyard at an angle, the stone pavement underneath her shattering and chips of concrete flying around her. She rolled forward, getting rid of her momentum as she came to a stop, on her back and staring upwards at a very surprised John Ark. Ah. Chapter 23, Reunion. Ah. John screamed, wheeling backwards and falling onto his bottom. Ruby stared in shock for another moment, surprised to see her former friend from Beacon, then leapt forward, clutching his throat and slamming him head into the ground. John's aura flared, the white glow protecting him from the damage but not preventing Ruby from choking him. Ruby leaned into him, whispering an apology as John's eyes rolled back into his head. She considered killing him, just to make sure there were no witnesses, but was interrupted by a shout. John! Kira yelled worriedly, dashing into the courtyard. Instantly taking in the scene in front of her, she threw out her shield, using her semblance to control it like a boomerang. Nora, Ren, get over here. Pulling her weapon out from her waistband, Ruby unfolded the scythe and deflected the shield, slamming it into the ground and jumping at Kira. Kira dodged her swing and stabbed forward, her weapon its double-edged short sword form, catching the edge of Ruby's denim jacket. Ruby jumped away and fired with her scythe, but Kira had pulled the shield back to herself and deflected the dust bullets. Switching her weapon to javelin form, she threw it lightning fast, a shot firing out the other end and propelling it forward. Too fast for Ruby to see, the javelin slammed through her chest and impaled her to the stone. Kira gaped in surprise as she watched Ruby immediately get back up, grasping the javelin and ripping it out of her chest. She threw the javelin far away, Kira's weapon landing in the gardens. Then Ruby was on her again, slamming her scythe into her shield. Kira was beginning to get pushed back, Ruby's scythe whirling from multiple directions and sometimes sliding past her shield, opening up cuts in her upper arms. Kira was tiring, her arms forced to move quickly in order to block Ruby's attacks. Finally, she slipped up, shield falling a little low. Hooking her blade around the edge of Kira's shield and throwing it to the side, Ruby rendered Kira defenseless and forced her off balance. Kira threw her arms up as Ruby swung her scythe around and prepared to cleave her in half. A sudden explosion of pink rocked Ruby's vision, momentarily stunning Ruby as she flew back and hit a stone bench, shattering it. Picking herself up, she caught a glimpse of Nora's orange hair before her hammer collided with Ruby, the pink recoil coming out of the other end adding extra power to her swing. Sailing through the air once more, she flew across the courtyard and slammed into a tree. A little disoriented, she shook her head and charged at Nora, who started backing up. Ren, help! She's like a zombie or something. I can't make her stay down. Ruby saw Kira in the corner of her eye as she ran towards Nora. Kira bent over John and trying to rouse him. She swung at Nora, who raised the handle of her hammer, the scythe blade scraping against it with a shower of sparks. Ruby spun away, pivoting, then turned back for a roundhouse kick, slamming her foot into Nora's stomach and knocking her back. Ren suddenly came from above, firing green blasts of aura from his gun. Ruby whirled her scythe, blocking most of the shots, and swung at Ren. Ren ducked and moved forward, jabbing his bladed pistols at her arms. Ruby twisted and evaded one of them, the other sinking into her shoulder. Shifting her grip, she reversed her scythe and jabbed the pointed back end at Ren, who dodged her stabs with light steps, taking the opportunity to move in even closer. Ren slammed the other pistol blade first into her thigh, freeing his hands, then flared his aura and hit her in the base of her throat with a double palm strike, pink shockwaves emanating outwards as Ruby flew back, taking Ren's pistols with her. Once again, Ruby stood up, rubbing her bruised throat and pulling out Ren's weapons, also throwing them far away. I see what you mean, Nora, Ren said, panting. Nora walked up and stood next to him, her weapon back in grenade launcher form and aimed at Ruby. Kira also stepped forward, John propped on her shoulder. "Why are you here, Ruby?" Kira asked. "Didn't you get sent to rogue camp?" Ruby shook her head. "I don't have time to talk, I need to see Everest." Nora had a quizzical expression on her face. "We're his bodyguards, Ruby, we can't just let you go see him, you know, with your criminal status and all." "Ruby, we can talk this out," Ren said, trying to placate her. "It's better if you guys didn't know about this," Ruby said with a grim expression. She scanned their faces, seeing that Ren and Kira were missing their weapons and John was unconscious. Ren and Pura's auras were flickering, Ruby's aura augmented attacks wearing them out and their own aura usage taking its toll. Quickly, she switched to her weapon to shotgun mode and shot Ren twice in the leg, a surprised expression on his face as he crumpled to the ground. "Ren!" Nora cried out. Switching targets, she shot Kira in the arm and shoulder before she could react, making her drop John and clutch her arm in pain. Nora's attention was focused on Ren, trying to help him up and stop his bleeding, so Ruby also shot Nora twice in the back, dropping her to the ground. Easier than expected, Ruby thought, feeling a little bad about taking advantage of their friendships with each other. Kira was on her knees, trying to stem the blood from her shoulder, so Ruby kicked her in the head, rendering her unconscious. Ren was writhing in pain on the ground, Nora weakly gasping beside him. John was beginning to wake up a little, so Ruby shot him twice in the legs and once more in his sword arm. John jerked awake with a pained gasp, looking around him in shock. "Ruby, what did you do?" He wheezed. He saw the bodies sprawled before him, his alarm growing. "You shot Kira," he shouted. "Sorry, but I can't let anything stop me," Ruby said, walking past them as she headed towards the mansion. Ruby felt something enter her and looked down, surprised at the sword that was coming out of her stomach. The blade glowed white, and Ruby turned around, seeing John emanating aura, his wound suddenly healed. "For Kira," he whispered, angry tears in his eyes. Ruby sighed and grabbed his right arm, closing her fist and shattering his bones. John let out a little scream and jerked his arm, his grip loosening from his sword, falling to his knees. Ruby pulled him up by his other arm, breaking it too, then kicked him in the legs to make sure that they were also broken. She pulled the sword out of her and tossed it to the ground. "You'll be fine once your aura recovers again," Ruby told him. She turned to walk away again, but John somehow managed to grab her ankle. "Please, help Kira," he gasped. "Don't let her die." Ruby looked back at the scene of carnage. Nora and Ren had fallen unconscious, suffering heavy blood loss. Kira was also unconscious, blood leaking out of her shoulder. Ruby didn't really know whether she wanted to kill them or not, but now that she had the chance to save them, she felt that she had to take some responsibility for her actions. Taking off her denim jacket, she tore it into strips and bound the worst of their wounds, stemming the blood flow. Shaking Ren and Kira awake, she told them to flare their auras and reinforce their bodies to slow the bleeding. Walking back over to John, who was slowly beginning to heal, his aura weakly returning, she told him to try to heal Nora or at least stop her bleeding with his aura. Finally done tending to her former friends, she walked out of the courtyard and headed for the mansion. A wide expanse of lawn separated the courtyard and the mansion, so Ruby hoped that Everest hadn't heard all the commotion she had made. She walked up to the double doors, slicing the lock at the front and entering the building. The interior was brilliantly white, marble surfaces everywhere. A large room was in front of her, decorated with paintings and tables with vases of flowers on top of them. Walking forward, she reached a pair of stairs, gray stone with black iron banisters, both leading to the upper floor. "Hello." Everest's voice came from the floor above her. "Did something happen?" "I happened," Ruby shouted, and leapt up the staircase, only needing to jump twice before reaching the second floor. She ran down the hallway, a door opening in front of her and a shocking Everest looking out. Increasing her speed, she grabbed Everest before he could move and threw him back inside his office, his body slamming into an oak table and breaking it in half, pens and paper flying across the room. Ruby shut the door behind her, folding her scythe and tucking it at her waist. Her hands were clenched into fists as she walked up to Everest, who was coughing and lying on the ground between the splintered halves of the desk. They told me you were at road camp, Ruby. He said, pushing himself up. And why are you only wearing pants? Ruby ignored his second question. I escaped, she said. How? Ruby let out a scream of frustration and grabbed his collar, holding him up. He was dressed in a white shirt and tie, with gray dress pants. Stop trying to distract me. She screamed. Why did you kill my parents? You were supposed to die too, Ruby. You weren't supposed to suffer like this, he said with a downcast expression. Ruby threw him again, slamming him into the wall. Answer my question. Tell me why. Everest coughed up a little blood, holding his palms out in front of him. Let me tell you my story, and then you can toss me around as much as you want, alright? Ruby resisted the urge to eat him alive, to rip out his flesh and veins and organs while he writhed and screamed. She growled but stood still, tapping her foot. Taking that as agreement, he began speaking. I was young, headstrong, and brash, and I saw the world in black and white, in absolutes. When my superiors approached me about creating a team of assassins to take down dissenting Faunus and their supporters, I readily agreed and enthusiastically embraced my job. He sighed. I thought that all who stood against us were evil. I truly thought we were doing the right things, that we were on the side of good. People like your parents, who strongly criticized our government and were becoming increasingly outspoken voices, had to die, had to be sacrificed for the greater good. Did you ever think about the children? What their lives would be like without their parents? Ruby asked in a pained voice. Everest shook his head. I wanted to get rid of them too. I wanted to make sure that those evil ideas didn't spread to future generations that might come back and bite us in the ass. I was wrong, Ruby, and I realized that far too late. So I tried to redeem myself by adopting a Faunus child. I loved him as if he were my real son. He was my pride and my joy. Although he wasn't very strong physically, he was extremely smart, earning him an invitation to Beacon. I eagerly agreed to send him there, and that's... He trailed off, his face growing taut. That's where I killed him, Ruby finished softly. You didn't just kill him, you tortured him to death and ate him, Everest said, growing angry. You had no right to do what you did. Ruby had gone in with the intention to take her revenge against Everest, but now she was having second thoughts. Hadn't she brutally killed his family member too? Hadn't she committed terrible wrongs against him? I don't think I'll ever forgive you, Ruby said slowly, but I don't think I have the right to kill you either. I guess both of us did horrible things to each other, Everest said, getting up. Ruby sighed, turning to leave. This meeting hadn't been what she had expected it to be, and now she felt a little lost and still unfulfilled. One more thing, Ruby, Everest suddenly said, remembering something. Maybe I can right some wrongs and help you begin to heal yourself. Ruby turned around, wondering what he was going to say. Alice is alive. Ruby reeled back, his mind thrown into disarray. What? You should see the look on your face, Everest chuckled. Frankly, she should have been dead. She had nearly no signs of life, and all the doctors gave up on her. And then her aura activates and she manages to hold herself together, enough for a couple rounds of blood transfusions. She was in and out of consciousness for a while, but last I heard, she had woken up and recovered fully. Ruby backed up a few steps, supporting herself against the wall. Thank you, thank you, thank you. She mumbled. I have to go. She opened up the door, and the 4 members of Team JNPR tumbled inside, having been trying to eavesdrop. Ruby stared at them. That was supposed to be a private conversation. We're his bodyguards, remember? Nora said, grinning. We get to spy on him for his own good. Where's your jacket? John asked, noticing her exposed chest and blushing. Ren shrugged off his green tunic, wearing a form-fitting black undershirt underneath it, and gave it to Ruby. Thanks, Ruby said, slipping it on. It was still a little big, the sleeves a bit too long, but it covered her. Everest smiled, evidently used to their quirks. Wait, how did you guys get assigned to Everest? Ruby wondered. We met him during his stay at Beacon, when he was investigating the attacks on the students, Pyrrha said. We met up with him, chatted a little, and he offered to let us be his bodyguards for real-world experience to advance in our hunter training. We didn't really expect to do anything, John said. I guess we were unprepared. Nah, You guys did fine. I just took advantage of you guys when we were talking, Ruby said. Ren shook his head. Kira stabbed you in the chest, I stabbed you in the arm and leg, and John said you stabbed you in the stomach. You weren't even tired, and all you did was ignore us and take our weapons away. How did you do that? Ruby shrugged. I dunno, she said truthfully. It just happens. Well, we need to have a rematch, Nora demanded. We'll fight again after I heal, and I won't go easy on you the next time, she promised. Stay with us a few days. Kira asked. I understand that you're a fugitive, but we promise not to turn you in. I just want to hear about what RWBY camp was like and how you escaped from there. Well, I sort of need to go somewhere, Ruby said hesitantly. She wanted to find allies, but she also wanted to reconnect with her friends. However, she didn't know if they could accept her after all she had done. Kira saw her hesitation and gave her a little smile. We also promise not to judge you, Ruby. Let's go talk for a while, for old time's sake, before you go. Alright, Ruby said, giving in. One more thing. She turned to address Everest. You told me that you wanted to keep those killings in your past. If I ever hear about a suspicious death or a random killing, and I suspect that it's you, I'll definitely be paying you a visit again, she threatened. Everest looked at her with an unreadable expression. I'm going to try to avoid killing innocents, Ruby, but sacrifices have to be made sometimes. And if I resign, someone worse, someone who enjoys having control over life and death, will take my place. He waved his hand. But don't worry, I'm working on something that will possibly eliminate the need for people like me, ever again. Ruby nodded and left the room, following the 4 team members. Chapter 24, Back. Ruby stayed for another 2 days at the mansion, telling the team about what it was like at the RWBY camp and how she escaped. Of course, she censored some details, but they still looked a little shocked at the lawlessness of the camp and the fact that Ruby was sent there in the first place. They avoided the topic of Ruby's past, trying to avoid judging her as they had promised. Ruby got a few more details from them about what Everest was doing, in order to eliminate the need for people like him. Blake and Yang asked us to help in a settling program, Kira explained. We were going to help skew the selected volunteers in favor of Faunus settlers, but Everest caught us. We thought he was going to arrest us, but after we explained what we were doing, he said that he would help. It was really surprising, Nora said, but I think, after overhearing your conversation, I understand why he's doing this. So what's the point? Ruby asked. We're going to help give the Faunus their own city, where they can live their lives freely and have their own independence, John said. And they'll also get some negotiating power in an informal state, Kira added. Hopefully, we'll finally be able to make some headway in Faunus human diplomacy. That sounds really good, Ruby said, impressed. So where is it? Ren shook his head. Sorry, Ruby, we can't really tell you. Private information, and all that. We weren't even supposed to know, but Blake heard them talking about it. Makes sense, Ruby said. Can't have people blabbing about the Faunus takeover of a settlement, I guess. As she was packing up to leave the next day, Ruby finished her story. And then I hijacked the hoverjet and parachuted down, landing in front of John. And then you know what happened next, Ruby finished. Yeah, I was really surprised, John said, and then you choked me unconscious before I could say anything. Well, at that point, I really wanted to kill Everest, Ruby said. I would have done anything to get to him. So, Ruby, what are you going to do now? Ren asked. I hope this trip has given you some sort of closing about the death of your parents. Ren, you're not supposed to say things like that out loud. Nora exclaimed, elbowing him. Sorry, Ruby, he's a little insensitive sometimes. It's alright, that's a good question, Ruby said, smiling. I'm going to go back to Beacon and then I'll see what I'll do from there. Why are you going back to Beacon? Kira asked, curious. Ruby said, blushing. There's someone I like there. Kira realized what was going on. Oh, well, good luck with that, she said, grinning. Yeah, good luck, Nora said. Ren and John also wished her luck as Ruby finished packing up her new set of belongings. They had given her a large travel bag, along with a new set of clothes. Her scythe had been cleaned and reloaded with her usual heavy-duty ammo. Everest had allowed her to use his private hoverjet, as her fugitive status would get her arrested if she used any of the airships for transportation. He said it was the first step toward righting the wrongs between us. He also gave Ruby a small card, looking like a miniature lean. You are strong, no doubt about it. You could use your strength for good, once you get your things taken care of. I asked JNPR to talk to you about the settling program, and I've decided that you could definitely help us. The coordinates are on here. Think about it. Ruby nodded and slipped the card into her pocket. She wouldn't even need it, as she was never going to leave Ali's again, but she appreciated the offer. Just before she left, Kira took her aside to talk to her in private. Ruby, I know I promised not to judge you, but can you tell me something? She asked. Sure, Ruby said. How do you feel mentally? Do you still want to injure and kill people, like you did back at Beacon? I don't want to send you back to Beacon so you can kill some more people. Kira, I'd like to think that I've changed. I messed up really bad in the past, but Ali's brings out the best in me, Ruby said. I can promise you that I won't kill anyone at Beacon. I'm really trying to change, Kira, I really am. Kira nodded. Alright, Ruby, she said, giving her a hug. I hope everything works out. Me too, Ruby responded quietly. As they flew to Beacon, Everest showed her how to properly use a parachute. Everest had been a bit stumped when he realized that he wouldn't be able to land normally and deliver Ruby as a passenger, but Ruby had the idea that she could parachute down properly this time. They arrived in a few hours, the afternoon sun illuminating Beacon in a warm glow. Ruby was wearing a white sweatshirt and gray sweatpants, trying to obscure as much of her features as possible. She held the large travel bag in one hand, a parachute pack on her back. Are you ready, Ruby? Ruby nodded, too excited to speak. He held out his hand. Let's both work towards becoming better people, alright? Ruby shook his hand. Thanks for the ride, Everest. Ruby opened the sliding door and jumped, beginning to freefall. The aerial view was spectacular, the columns and towers of Beacon rising into the sky, the sprawling courtyards and ponds forming geometric patterns. Ruby aimed for the edge of the emerald forest, trying to remain out of sight. She opened her parachute 2,000 feet above the forest, her descent slowing as she continued to fall. Right before she hit the trees, she puffed out the canopy of her parachute a little more, slowing her fall to a crawl before she hit the trees, smashing through thin branches until she hit the ground. Dusting herself off, she slipped out of the parachute pack and picked up her travel bag, beginning the trek to her dorm room. She planned to stop by her room first, to see how Yang and Blake were doing and to grab her lean so she could access her inheritance. Pulling up her hoodie and shrouding her face, she pretended to be just another student as she walked through the courtyard and into the school. Traveling down familiar hallways, she noted that the damage she had done had been fixed, the walls put back up with a fresh coat of paint on them. She finally arrived at her dorm room, nervously setting down her bag and adjusting the bottom of her sweatshirt. Reminding herself that Blake and Yang had tried to help her escape, she knocked on the door. Half a minute later, the door opened and Blake's head popped out. Hey, who's? Her eyes widened, recognizing Ruby's face. Ruby immediately grabbed her throat and shoved her back into the room, closing the door behind her. Shish, Ruby whispered furiously. She let go of her and Blake stumbled back, coughing. Yang came out of the guest room, wondering who had been at the door. Ruby? She asked, unbelieving. Yup, Ruby said. Hi, Yang. The two were wearing shorts and t-shirts, their clothes hastily thrown on and their hair messy. Blake moved in front of Yang, blocking Ruby's view. What are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be in RWBY camp? She asked, frowning. Ruby sighed, having been asked that question for the umpteenth time. I escaped, long story, and I'm here to get my lean and see Yang again. It's alright, Blake, Yang said softly, gently moving her aside. So how are you, sis? I'm okay. I just wanted to see you again, before I leave. Ruby held her arms out for a hug. We should report her, Blake said fiercely. She's been at RWBY camp, and she somehow managed to escape when nobody else has been able to. We don't know how much she's changed. Stay away from her, Yang. Ruby saw the hesitation in Yang's eyes and dropped her arms. It's fine, I understand, she said sadly. Ruby. It was good seeing you again, Ruby said. I'll just get my lean and leave. They watched her from across the room as she walked to her bunk bed, lifting the mattress up and grabbing the lean she had stashed under it. Ruby suddenly thought of something. If they reported her, her meeting with Alice would be compromised. She spun on them, making the two flinch. You're not going to report me, or you? She asked, a hand on her side. Of course not, sis, Blake interrupted her. Of course we're going to report her. She's a dangerous criminal who just escaped one of the most heavily guarded prisons on Vital. Ruby's face took on a bleak expression. Are you sure, Blake? She unzipped her travel bag, quickly pulling out her weapon in shotgun form. Move and I'll shoot you both. Don't think about running, I'll shoot you enough that your aura won't be able to protect you. Blake, Young hissed, that wasn't really smart of you. Or not even armed. She raised her voice so Ruby could hear. Ruby, I won't call the cops on you, promise. She nudged Blake. Fine, Blake said, acquiescing. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Ruby said, her vision growing red and hazy, all of her instincts screaming at her to shoot them and get it over with. Don't do this, Ruby, Young pleaded. Blake suddenly leapt forward, intent on disarming her, her faunus speed making her a blur as she shot across the room. In a shower of petals, Ruby vanished and reappeared behind her, her shotgun holstered again, one hand slamming down on her neck while her other hand grabbed her forearm, twisting it and pushing Blake to the floor. Blake spat out a mouthful of carpet. Young, get her. Young had a moment of doubt, but then made up her mind, seeing her lover on the floor. She flared her aura, fire exploding outwards from her, and dashed at Ruby. Ruby let go of Blake's arm, blocking Yang's first punch with her palm, but then Yang's other fiery fist slammed into her midsection, sending her flying back into one of the bunk beds, the rope snapping and the bed crushing Ruby. Blake rolled her head and cracked her neck as Young helped her up. The bed suddenly burst apart, wood fragments and stuffing flying everywhere, the mattress springs bouncing across the room. Ruby jumped onto her feet, her aura flaring a dark red around her, her teeth bared in anger and her gray eyes coated in red, her sense of reason gone. Young, we can't stop her without our weapons. I'll go get my blade, keep her busy. Young nodded, crouching down and lowering her center of gravity. Ruby sprung off of her heels at Young, hands outstretched. She grabbed onto her shoulder even as Young punched her rapidly in the stomach, 1-2-1-2, her aura adding small bursts of fire to each punch. Ruby didn't let go, instead grabbing with both hands and squeezing. Young gave out a little cry as her shoulder bone fractured, her flames flaring even brighter. And then a ribbon was around her neck, strangling her. Ruby felt her vertebrae crack as Blake dragged her off of Young, swinging her around and slamming her into the wall. A shower of petals, and Ruby was behind Blake again, a closed fist hammering into the side of her head. Blake stumbled and blurred across the room, and Ruby dashed again to follow her, chasing her around. Finally, Blake stopped, exhausted, and began to swing her sword, predicting where Ruby would appear. Ruby stopped in front of Blake, and then the sword was swinging at Ruby's chest, and Ruby tried to block it by slapping down the flat of the blade with her palm. The sword angled down, barely slicing into Ruby's left leg, her aura blocking most of it, as she swiped at Blake's throat, her fingers ripping open her neck. Blake moved back, clutching her throat, blood leaking out from the shallow wound as Ruby stumbled forward, intent on finishing her off. And then something punched into her head, her vision briefly flickering. Young was back up, one arm held at an awkward angle but still functioning, grabbing Ruby's neck and punching her again in the head. Ruby tried to push her off but Young never stopped, punching repeatedly, fire encircling her arm, as she dragged Ruby to the window. Ruby slumped to the floor, dazed, as Young opened up the window, picked her up by the neck, and threw her out of it. Her traveling bag sailed out after her, the bag landing on Ruby with a grunt. Yang's head poked out of the window, an angry expression on her face. Come back to your senses, Ruby, and leave before I really report you. The window slammed shut. The cool air swept over Ruby, the sun now setting, her numb skin barely tingling, as she idly wondered if anyone had heard them. Yang was gone. Ruby had hurt Blake, and Young would never forgive her for that. Alice was her only hope. She stifled a sob as she picked herself up, her grief drowning any lingering rage. The minor injury on her leg stained her gray sweatpants red as she crept off the school boundaries, toward the emerald forest, toward Alice. A knock sounded at the door, so Alice set down the dishes and wiped her hands on the towel. "I'm coming," she sang. She opened the door, an unexpected sight greeting her. A young girl was standing in front of her, barely taller than herself, having a pretty face with black-red hair. She held a bag, wearing a white sweatshirt with its hood pulled down, a hopeful expression on her face. Blood stained her sweatpants, a cut on her thigh. "Do you need any help?" Alice immediately asked, seeing her bloody appearance. The girl's face went pale. "Alice, don't you remember me?" Alice shook her head. "I think I would remember someone as distinctive as you," she said slowly. I, the girl choked up, at a loss for words. "Why don't you come inside?" Alice said, gently taking her hand. "We can talk in here and get everything sorted out." Alice led the stunned girl to the coffee table, sitting down on the couch next to her. Her face was buried in her hands, tears trickling out from between her fingers. "What's your name?" Alice asked, rubbing her back and trying to console her. She felt the girl shiver. "Ruby," she whispered, "Ruby Rose." Alice felt a tug at her mind, a brief image flickering into existence then fading. "I feel like I should know you from somewhere," Alice said, hesitating. Ruby looked up, her gray eyes staring into hers. "You should," she growled, and suddenly grabbed Alice. Hat. Alice squeaked out, Ruby's movement startling her. Ruby ignored her protests, nuzzling her face in Alice's warm neck, planting a kiss on her soft skin. She felt Alice's body tremble, the little ears in her head twitching, her breaths becoming shallower, more rapid. Something told her to go further, to push her down, to violate her, to rip her head off. Ruby let go of her, forcing those feelings down, unwilling to hurt Alice no matter what. She could take her time, let Alice learn to love her again, recreate their relationship. Alice was flustered, confused by her own reaction. Ruby interrupted her thoughts. "Why don't you remember anything, Alice?" she asked. Alice shrugged, her cheeks still pink. "The doctors told me I had been in a coma, and that I had something called retrograde amnesia. I can't really remember anything from the past year or so, although some things are slowly coming back." Ruby thought for a moment. "Alice," she asked softly, "do you have a dress and cloak somewhere?" "It's red and black." Alice nodded. "I didn't know whose it was, so I kept it in the closet." "Is it yours?" "I made it, while I was living here," Ruby answered. "Wait just a second," Alice said, getting up. She walked down the hallway, rummaging around the closet and pulling out a red and black bundle. It was surprisingly heavy, the clothes made from dense material. She handed it to Ruby, who reached out to receive it. "Thank you," Ruby said, smiling, and Alice's heart stuttered, a memory trickling back. And then another set of knocks came at the door, and Alice got up, a look of worship entering her eyes. "She's home," she breathed, getting up and running to the door. And Ruby's world fell down around her as Weiss stepped in, sweeping Alice up and kissing her. And Weiss broke off the kiss and looked at Ruby, shock entering her eyes. "Get behind me," she told Alice, and stepped in front of her. Weiss pulled out Mertonaster, aiming it at Ruby, but all Ruby did was stare at Weiss, an understanding coming into her eyes. "You did this," Ruby cried, tears leaking from her eyes. "You took her from me again." In a blink and scattering of rose petals, she dashed in front of Weiss, grabbing the collar of her dress and lifting her up. Weiss reacted instinctively, stabbing her sword into Ruby's side, but Ruby ignored it, unfeeling. Alice let out a little gasp, reaching forward, but Weiss told her to stay back. "How could you?" she demanded, shaking Weiss. "Why would you do this?" Weiss shook her head. "Ruby, let's talk somewhere else, alright? Away from." Ruby looked around her, seeing the shocked and conflicted Alice staring at them, hands over her mouth. Ruby wanted to cry, wanted to tell her that she wasn't the bad guy, but there was nothing she could say that would convince her. Another scattering of petals, and they were on the roof of the small cottage, Ruby still holding Weiss up. "Ruby." Weiss asked. Can you let me down? Ruby instead slammed her into the tiles, bending down over her. Tell me why I shouldn't kill you, she breathed, her glistening teeth bared. Weiss sucked a breath, the air having been knocked out of her. She fell into a coma, and I was there when she woke up, Weiss said. I thought she died, I thought she couldn't be saved, but she lived and I was so happy. I stayed by her bedside for an entire week, and one night, she woke up. She took another breath, gulping, reliving the memory. And she told me that she loved me, Weiss said, awe on her face. Ruby hated her expression, her words, she wanted to break her. But she held herself still and listened. She said that she loved me, Weiss repeated, and she said that I was beautiful. She wanted to be with me forever, and who was I to stop her? I loved her back. I loved her too, Ruby said in a tight voice. But I thought you were gone, Weiss explained, locked up forever in the RWBY camp. Alice needed someone, and she wanted to be with me, and so. She trailed off. Ruby let go of Weiss, sitting down next to her, resigned to the events that had occurred. I see, Ruby said. Weiss got up, and they sat in silence for a few minutes, Weiss warily watching her. Ruby finally spoke again. I'm glad Alice found someone. She was always lonely, always by herself in this cottage, she said, standing up. She wiped her cheeks, clearing away the last remnants of tears and love. It was good seeing you again, Ruby said in a sad voice. If Alice remembers anything else, tell her that I forgive her, and tell her to just forget about me. Weiss cautiously nodded, a hand still in her sword. Ruby gave her one last broken smile, and jumped off of the roof. She stepped past Alice, who had been watching them speak, uncomprehending, and went inside to grab her bag. Reappearing outside of the cottage, she looked back one more time, taking one last glance at Alice and what had been her home. And then she disappeared into the forest, rose petals scattering. Weiss stepped down from the roof, landing softly on a glyph. She walked up to Alice, giving her a hug, checking her for injuries. Were you okay? Did she do anything? Alice shook her head, whispering a no. They went back inside. Alice was silent for the rest of the evening,